Such an unneeded remake that was made simply to get more money out of the diehard fans of the series. I hated this game and it completely ruined the first games in the series. Today we're looking at some of the worst Pokemon takes I could find on Metacritic, and I didn't have to look very hard. Like this review of Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green, a 3 out of 10, excuse me, a 3. And the reason is somehow that these games were unneeded and ruined Pokemon Red and Blue. These games took the original Kanto adventure, fixed a lot of the technical issues from Generation 1, added abilities, breeding improvements, held items, better graphics, wireless connectivity, and even an entirely new post-game area with the Sevi Islands. So when I read a review claiming that Fire Red and Leaf Green ruined the originals, my first question isn't how, it's,
did we even play the same game?
Maybe you don't think every game needs to be remade, but saying Fire Red and Leaf Green ruined the original Red and Blue? Come on. That's like saying my dusty old VHS tape of Pokemon the first movie is somehow ruined by the digital remaster. Just go play the original games. And if this is the review we're starting with, I can only imagine what's in the depths of the user reviews of Metacritic and what it has in store for us. The worst of which will go into the Hall of Shame. So let's see if there's any out there that have any good points or if they're complete doo-doo. So next I have a review from someone who gave Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green a 2 out of 10. But unlike the last review, this one is actually trying to make an argument. The first generation of Pokemon games were lackluster, but they were at least excusable, because it was the first entry of a series that didn't yet know what it was. I don't know how people defend these games that could have fixed so many of the game's issues, but instead decided the only change worth making was the waste of time known as the Sevi Islands. Kanto already had a terrible variety of Mons, making you still encounter Pidgeys when you were 6 badges in while locking most of the actually interesting ones behind the Safari Zone or hard-to-reach dungeon floors. Black and White had about the same number, and they were constantly giving you new and interesting Pokemon to catch in every location. I guess I don't completely disagree with every point here. Kanto obviously has less variety than most later regions, but Pidgey's the regional bird. Imagine there were no birds. Square Dash World, no birds. I guess compared to Unova, where you're constantly finding new Pokemon on every route, Kanto could feel a little repetitive. Kanto is just a boring region with a boring early game. No story, no interesting characters, nothing that makes you want to explore, and a late game that feels unfinished. How did they already make a good game in Ruby and Sapphire and then fail to fix the glaring mistakes that made Gen 1 such a slog to get through? This game isn't worth your time. Go replay Gen 5. Okay, so if I had to summarize this review in one sentence, it would basically be, Kanto is boring. But you've lost me at the score, dude. 2 out of 10? Really? Even if we granted every criticism this reviewer makes, we're still talking about one of the most polished Pokemon games on the Game Boy Advance. All the mechanics that were in Ruby and Sapphire that we didn't get in the original Gen 1 games, but they gave players entirely new areas to explore, and expanded the post-game beyond what it was in the original. I think the biggest issue with this review is that it spends more time criticizing Kanto instead of Fire Red and Leaf Green specifically. That's a fair discussion to have. Maybe Kanto isn't your favorite region. Clearly you like Unova. But that's very different from saying Fire Red and Leaf Green are terrible games. This sounds like someone who just doesn't like Kanto. Next up we have a review of Ruby and Sapphire that gave it a 2 out of 10, and I have to admit, this one confused me a little bit. Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire are a massive step backwards from the previous generation of Gold, Silver, and Crystal. Day and Night is gone, and so is going to multiple regions. It does, though, however, mark the start of double battles, natures, and abilities that have become staples of the series ever since, at the expense of making it much more complicated on the player's end compared to the first 2 generations of the games. The game overall is challenging, with a fantastic soundtrack that is easily among the best in the series to this day, and the new Pokemon introduced in this generation are truly great. As soon as you beat this game though, it grinds to a complete halt. But this seems to be a chronic problem with the Pokemon games in general across the generations for the most part, with only a handful of exceptions. So let me get this straight. The reviewer says Ruby and Sapphire introduced abilities, they introduced natures, they introduced double battles, they have a fantastic soundtrack, one of the best in the series, he said, they're challenging, and the new Pokemon are great. But despite all of that, a 2 out of 10? I feel like I'm reading 2 completely different reviews here. I would say the day and night cycle could be considered a step back, and not being able to transfer your Pokemon from Gen 2 to Gen 3 because of the technical limitations between the Game Boy and the Game Boy Advance, that was sad. So I can understand why longtime fans might be disappointed, but I think this review loses some perspective. Ruby and Sapphire weren't just removing things, they kind of rebuilt Pokemon from the ground up. All those things we talked about that it introduced, and it contains some of the most iconic Pokemon in the franchise. A lot of the mechanics that are kind of taken for granted started right in Gen 3. And one of the weirdest part about this review is that the reviewer seems to agree with that. They spend most of the review praising the game's innovations and talking about how great the soundtrack and the Pokemon are, and then they hit it with a 2. A score that low usually suggests a broken game, like a game that barely functions, with no redeeming qualities. But I feel like that's not the game being described here. It's less of a 2 out of 10 score and more of like someone who's just ranting because they're disappointed that Ruby and Sapphire weren't Gold and Silver too. Next, we have a review of Pokemon Platinum, and I'm going to go ahead and point out that this person gave it a 0 out of 10. Let's see what his reasoning is. Really boring, stretched gameplay, almost no usable Pokemon, characters have no lore at all, and way too many caves. Now I'm not sure where to begin here. First of all, Platinum having almost no usable Pokemon? We're talking about the game that expanded Sinnoh's dex, specifically because Diamond and Pearl had been criticized for lacking variety. We got Houndoom, Togekiss, Gallade, Rotom Forms, Gliscor, Mamoswine, Tangrowth, Yanmega, and a ton of Pokemon to make team building actually interesting. You can dislike Sinnoh's regional Pokedex, sure, but almost no usable Pokemon? That's a little dramatic. Then we have the claim that the characters have no lore. Maybe they're not groundbreaking, but this is the same game that gave us Cyrus, one of the most memorable villains in the franchise. We got Distortion World lore involving Giratina, Cynthia, and a bunch of expanded mythology surrounding Sinnoh's legendary Pokemon. You don't have to love it, but saying there's no lore feels like we maybe skipped over every dialogue box throughout the entire playthrough. Now I did laugh at the final complaint. Way too many caves! Alright, I'll give him that one. Mount Coronet is about enough cave to qualify as its own region, but I wouldn't give it a 0 out of 10 because I had to use a lot of repels. I bet he got stuck in Mount Coronet and probably never finished the game. Because when I think about Pokemon Platinum, it's one of, if not my favorite in the series. Here's another 0 out of 10 for Diamond and Pearl. Let's hear him out. I hate this game. Too slow and it's a Pokemon game. Pokemon games just suck. Really, like WoW. I hate Pokemon. I don't even know if that was a review. The first complaint is that the game is too slow. Honestly, that's actually a pretty common criticism of Diamond and Pearl. The health bars are slow, the surfing is slow. Even a lot of Diamond and Pearl fans would admit that the original games had some pacing issues. That's part of the reason Platinum is always recommended as the definitive Sinnoh experience. I didn't have Platinum, I played Diamond first, and I was just so blown away by the graphics and the soundtrack, I didn't even really notice. I was much younger, but still. Then the review suddenly takes a hard turn. It's a Pokemon game, and I'm not really sure what we're supposed to do with that information. That's like giving Mario Kart a bad review because it's a racing game, or Tetris a bad review because there are too many blocks. At that point, we're not really criticizing the game, we're just criticizing the entire concept. My favorite part is the ending. Wow, I hate Pokemon. You might not be the target audience. 0 out of 10, this game has Pokemon in it. This is a pretty high bar for bad takes. I don't know who's gonna end up in the Hall of Shame. Next, I have a user review for Pokémon Emerald that gave the game a 4 out of 10. Let's see why. Almost the same game as Ruby and Sapphire, but even worse. More HMs, more stupid fillers, almost no additions, same stupid story. This game has gotten old. The only good addition was the Battle Frontier, and it's still something boring, repetitive, and almost unplayable these days. There's even a place where the game plays for you. So fun! Okay, so his main argument is that Emerald is basically just Ruby and Sapphire again, but more filler and the same story. And according to them, the only worthwhile addition is the Battle Frontier, which he still said was boring and repetitive. I guess it's a better review because at least, unlike the guy who gave Platinum a 0 because of the caves, he's actually criticizing features of the game. Emerald is absolutely the enhanced version of Ruby and Sapphire, rather than a completely new experience. The story does follow the same general structure. You're still in Hoenn, you're still collecting badges, you're still stopping Team Aqua and Team Magma. I get that, but where I completely disagree is the idea that the only meaningful addition is the Battle Frontier, because Emerald also expanded the story, gave both villain teams larger roles, added new gym leader rematches, improved trainer teams, changed encounter locations, added the Battle Frontier itself, which is a gigantic addition, and it became what fans view as the definitive Hoenn experience. And again, it's funny that he said the Battle Frontier is the only good addition, and then immediately says it's boring, because for a lot of long-time Pokemon fans, the Battle Frontier is one of the reasons Emerald is remembered so fondly. Some of us spent hundreds of hours there trying to earn all the symbols. Some players have never emotionally recovered from losing their win streak. And then he's got to complain about a place where the game plays for you, which I'm assuming is referring to the Battle Palace. Watching your Pokemon ignore the move you wanted can definitely be frustrating. But I don't know if one facility in the Battle Frontier is enough to tank the entire game's score. Sounds like this guy wanted Emerald to be a whole new game, but that's not what the goal of it was. It was the definitive version of Ruby and Sapphire. And judging by how many fans still rank it as one of the best games in the series, I'd say it did a pretty good job. Here's one on Pokémon X that says trash, and then he gives it a 0. Treasure or trash. I guess that explains the review. You know, what's the point of reviewing something if you're just gonna give it a one-word review? It's not really a review if you're just gonna put trash. Let's check out this guy's page. Oh, okay. It's all making sense now. He gave Moon a 10 and Ultra Moon 0. It's like a gimmick. He does 0s or 10s. Get out of here with that. X and Y, 0. Not really even worth addressing. Alright, let's check out this review of Pokemon Black and White. This and boring game. Black 2, White 2 is so much better. The Progene Soyans is so slow. Progression. He means progression. The Fire Starter. The anime. This. Pokemon Black is not a good game. Probably one of the worst. 4 out of 10. And Black 2, White 2 is a 10 out of 10. Okay, so apparently the progression is too slow, the Fire Starter is bad, and therefore Pokemon Black is one of the worst games ever made. I'm not exactly sure how we got from point A to point D, but let's work through it. It is a little bit slower than later entries, but Generation 5 spends a lot of time introducing characters and building up Team Plasma's story, compared to something like Red and Blue, where you're basically thrown out the door after 10 minutes. Black and White definitely take a more story-driven approach. Then he starts talking about the Fire Starter. Tepig, my boy Tepig. Everyone has starter preferences. But the disrespect. Maybe you're one of the 7 people that never stop talking about Snivy. But I don't know if disliking one starter is enough to condemn the entire game. The funniest part of this review is the ending, because after spending the entire review explaining why Pokemon Black is terrible, he then just casually drops Black 2 and White 2 are a 10 out of 10. He agrees Generation 5 is amazing, or at least it became amazing. Eventually. Black 2 and White 2 don't really exist without Pokemon Black and White. The characters return, the region returns, the story continues. It's literally a sequel. He just wanted to skip to the sequel, I guess. I can understand preferring Black 2 and White 2, but calling Pokemon Black one of the worst games in the series, while giving its direct sequel a perfect score, it's a little silly. Next, I have a review for Pokemon Heart Gold and Soul Silver that gave the games a 1 out of 10. Let's see what the issue is. It's a bad Pokemon game. Not only that, but the only Pokemon game that is bad. All others are at least okay, but this one is slow, bland, not innovative, and they managed to make the few minigames weird and unplayable. It's also for the other games' looks, what Polar Express is to reality. This ugliness makes the game even more boring than it adding nothing did. I saw some people praising it in the past, but every time I looked up, turned out to be some teenager who grew up when this one was new. In other words, if nostalgia and vanity over your own childhood are the only reasons you play a game, go for it. But if you want a good game, play Fire Red, or really any other Pokemon game. Okay, so according to this reviewer, Heart Gold and Soul Silver are not only bad, they are the They are the only bad Pokemon games. That's a pretty bold opening statement. His main argument is that people play it out of nostalgia. He says they're slow, bland, ugly, not innovative, and that the fans are only praising them because they grew up with them. I think this review is a little bit of a mess, because Heart Gold and Soul Silver weren't just popular with people who grew up with it, or people who just grew up with Gold and Silver. They're still popular with people playing them today. I think when people usually talk about it, they aren't just talking about nostalgia. They're talking about having 2 regions to explore. They're talking about Pokemon following you outside of their Pokeballs, the remastered soundtrack, the huge amount of post-game content, and the sheer amount of stuff packed into these games. Now, they can be slow. The level curve has been criticized for years, so grinding can be a little frustrating, and some players feel that Johto's Pokemon distribution isn't as strong as it could be. Those would be perfectly fair criticisms, but a 1 out of 10? I'm not following that logic. 1 out of 10 suggests there's nothing good about it, and I feel like he struggles to name exactly why it deserves that score. The best part is where he says that
if nostalgia and vanity over your own childhood are the only reasons you play a game, go for it.
So is it more likely that millions of Pokemon fans are fooling themselves? Or is it possible they actually genuinely like the game? I guess you're allowed to dislike them. Not everyone likes every Pokemon game. But if your explanation for why the games aren't good is because of nostalgia, you're probably spending more time reviewing the Pokemon fans themselves than the actual games. Well, we've reached the end, at least of what I can take today. And somehow we managed to find someone who gave Pokemon Black a bad score because of Tepig. But now it's time to decide which review deserves a permanent place in the Hall of Shame. And I think there's only one real contender. The winner is... I hate this game. Too slow, and it's a Pokemon game. Pokemon games just suck. Really, like WoW. I hate Pokemon. Out of everything we've looked at today, this is the one that managed to explain nothing about Diamond and Pearl while reviewing it. So for being the shortest review, the least informative review, and somehow giving us the unforgettable criticism of 0 out of 10 contains Pokemon, I hereby induct this review into the Pokemon Review Hall of Shame. But now I want to hear from you guys. What's the worst take you've ever heard or ever seen online? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching, and follow my channel for more Pokemon.